to today's webinar. On behalf of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health and the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces here at the University of California, Berkeley, I'd very much like to welcome you to today's webinar on the topic Improving Employee Emotions and Emotion Regulation with Carolyn Winslow. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. You'll be muted during this presentation, so if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online chat or Q&A. And at the completion of the presentation, Dr. Winslow will spend 5 to 10 minutes answering your questions. There is one continuing education contact hour available for this webinar for a fee of $30. And if you wish to obtain credit, please register again at coeh.berkeley.edu. And you'd also need to complete the evaluation for the webinar, and then you'd be emailed a certificate of completion. After today, the webinar will be archived and a link will be provided to the attendees afterwards by email. So thank you again for joining us, and at this time I'm very pleased to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Carolyn Winslow. She's an industrial organizational psychologist and researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces here in the School of Public Health. Her program of research has focused on exploring ways of enhancing employee well-being through the cultivation of positive feelings, behaviors, and cognitions, as well as through mitigation of the harmful effects of negative emotions and work stress. So I'm very pleased on behalf of COEH and the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces to welcome Dr. Winslow to today's webinar. Welcome.
Thank you, Julia, for the introduction. I'm flattered to have been invited by COEH to give this webinar, and I hope that the attendees will enjoy it and learn something new. So welcome, everyone. I'm having difficulty moving my slides forward. Don't know why that would be. Oh, there we go. So welcome. These are the learning objectives for today's webinar. By the end of the webinar, you should be able to explain the relationship between employee emotional experiences and list several organizationally valued outcomes. Second, list several organization and person-focused strategies for improving employee emotional experiences. And I'll get into exactly what that means shortly. Third, review research on the effectiveness of self-guided emotion regulation strategies. And finally, discuss opportunities for future research on employee affect and emotion regulation. I want to begin today's webinar by taking a step back and providing some definitions of terms, as I think that doing so will help to clarify and also lay the groundwork for this presentation. So employee affect is an umbrella term encompassing a broad range of feelings that individuals experience. This includes discrete emotions, mood, and dispositional or trait affect. Starting with discrete emotions, these are in the moment, short-term, and relatively intense emotional experiences that are usually focused on a specific target or cause. Examples include anger, fear, pride, sadness, joy, grief, gratitude, and frustration. In the work context, one might feel angry at another team member for not submitting something to a client on time, and another person may feel grateful for their supervisor's guidance on a difficult project. Although these discrete emotions are typically short-lived, they can morph into a mood, which is formally defined as a global pleasant or unpleasant feeling. The important distinguishing feature from discrete emotions is that a mood tends to be diffuse rather than focused on a specific cause. Also, a mood is medium in duration, meaning it's a bit more persistent than fleeting discrete emotions. For example, words usually just used to describe moods can include feeling generally pleasant, negative, cheerful, or irritable. Someone at work may be generally cheerful after having just returned from a vacation, for example, or conversely irritable when they find out that they need to work an extra shift. The third and final affect term I'll discuss is dispositional or trait affect. This refers to a person's overall general tendency to respond to situations in stable, predictable ways. You can think of it as the lens through which a given person tends to view the world. There may be, for example, coworkers of yours who, no matter what's going on around them, tend to remain positive and upbeat, the Tiggers in your lives, whereas others are perpetually pessimistic and down, the so-called Eeyores of the world. After an emotion has been appraised or a mood noticed by the individual experiencing it, one of several so-called emotion regulation strategies is then employed. Emotion regulation is defined as what people do to alter the experience, expression, and future course of affective experiences. Like I said, there are several different strategies or forms of emotion regulation. Gross and Thompson, in particular, propose a neat classification called the process model of emotion regulation. This model distinguishes strategies based on when they take place. Now, I don't have time today to go into detail about this model, but to briefly give you a sense, these strategies outlined in this model range from purposeful selection and modification of situations based on understanding their emotional consequences, here what's called situation selection and modification, to thinking about something other than the emotion and its causes, which is called attentional deployment, to reframing the situation in order to change one's reaction to it, also called cognitive reappraisal, and then finally, changing the outward and perhaps also inward expression of the emotion. This is emotional expression suppression. Many of the person-focused strategies I'll be discussing in this presentation can be mapped onto different parts of this model. So why does affect and affect regulation matter in organizations? Well, first, employee affect is being increasingly recognized as a component of theoretical models of employee health and well-being. Specifically, scholars and practitioners alike suggest that employee health and well-being is multidimensional, and that it includes emotional well-being as an important aspect of broader psychological well-being. Take, for example, this currently in press model of worker well-being that was recently developed by researchers at RAND and NIOSH. Here, you can see that worker well-being is said to consist of 4 components, one of which is work evaluation and experience. This component is defined by the authors as consisting of 1, satisfaction with one's job, supervisor, or other aspects of the work. 2, as a sense of meaning and purpose. And finally, affect, which here they consider to consist of the positive and negative emotions people experience at work. Beyond theoretical models, a considerable amount of empirical research has linked employee affect to valued individual and organization level outcomes. At the individual level, perhaps not surprisingly, a considerable amount of research has shown affect's influence on work performance metrics. These include supervisory evaluations, negotiating ability, pro-social behaviors, and even higher income. These findings are consistent with the so-called happy, productive worker hypothesis, which suggests that happy workers ought to be productive ones. Notably, this relationship between affect and performance has held in experimental, cross-sectional, and longitudinal studies, even after controlling for possible confounding variables and using both objective and subjective performance ratings. I do think it's important, however, to mention that most of these studies have examined trait rather than state affect or mood, because the influence of the latter is much more difficult to measure and evaluate because it's fleeting. In addition to performance, affect at the individual level has also been linked to other outcomes, including enhanced decision-making, creativity, work group dynamics, such as increased cooperation and decreased conflict, leadership, and finally, research suggests that employees' emotional experiences can be related to intent to turnover, actual turnover, and absence. Much of the research that has been done to establish these connections, there is much research that's been done to establish these connections. Accordingly, the citations that I've listed on the slides are mostly reviews of these literatures. Taken together, looking at the literature, I think we can safely say that affect is a critical influence on organizational variables. So I've talked about the outcomes affect is said to influence. What about the antecedents? In other words, what are the determinants of employee affect? One popular theoretical model suggests that there are three broad contributing factors. First, a genetically determined set point for experiencing positive affect. That is, heritable traits that determine set point or set range for a given individual. Second, circumstantial factors, such as what's going on in your life. And third, intentional activities and practices. Those behaviors that you voluntarily do on a regular basis to maintain positive emotional states and decrease negative ones. The pie chart here is said to represent the amount of variance that can be predicted by these three components. Interestingly, genetics and intentional activities account for a whopping 90% of the variance, whereas circumstances only account for 10%. It's important to note, however, that this model focuses on determinants of happiness as opposed to affect per se. Still, though, I think there's sufficient reason to believe that the same factors influencing happiness can also influence affect, in part because happiness or well-being can be viewed as a broader construct that includes affect. So you can't change genetics or circumstances usually, so the rest of this webinar will focus on research on the third factor, those intentional activities, in order to understand how to address those parts that can change. Before getting into the person-focused interventions, though, I want to review some organization-focused approaches that can be utilized to enhance worker well-being, either separately or in combination with the person-focused approaches. These organization-focused approaches can be broadly defined as planned, behavioral, theory-based actions to remove or modify the causes of job stress at work and aim to improve the health and well-being of participants. Typically, these focus on either changing the characteristics of the task, the working conditions, and/or the social relationships at work. Regarding task characteristics, the idea is that tasks should be interesting, reasonably complex, and have some degree of variability and autonomy. Task-directed attempts to improve health and well-being, therefore, often focus on improving simple and repetitive jobs, adding elements that increase responsibility, such as planning, quality control, and maintenance, etc., often through job enrichment and job rotation. Changes in working conditions refer to ergonomic aspects, environmental issues such as noise, temperature, etc., and to issues of workload and working time. Finally, efforts to improve social relationships focus on improving social support, conflict management, or communication in general. Often within this approach, supervisors are trained in improving role clarity, giving feedback, carrying out performance appraisals, and resolving conflicts. These organizational level interventions can be contrasted with person-focused interventions, which represent attempts to directly target the individual and their thoughts and behaviors, rather than the environment in which they operate. So in what remains of this presentation, I'll be highlighting such person-focused strategies, many of which come from the positive psychology literature. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll define person-focused strategies as treatment methods or intentional activities that aim to cultivate positive feelings, behaviors, or cognitions. Notably, the activities that consist of such interventions are aimed at building positive emotions and other positive outcomes in addition to or instead of simply remedying or alleviating negative ones, as has been the typical paradigm in psychology more generally. One potential advantage of these interventions is that they typically entail activities that individuals can do themselves without support from either another individual, such as a coach or program facilitator, or even from the organization itself. They're also usually relatively brief, as you'll see, and non-stigmatizing as compared to, for example, stress management interventions. I'll discuss 4 different broad types of such interventions, namely gratitude, acts of kindness, job crafting, and using one's personal strengths. For each type, I will describe the activity and provide a summary of information on evidence for its effectiveness. Of note, this webinar is not meant to be a comprehensive review of the literature. Instead, my intent is to give you an overall bird's eye view, but with some degree of depth. So first, let's turn to gratitude activities. Gratitude can be considered one of the discrete emotions I mentioned earlier, and is defined as recognizing and responding with grateful emotion to the roles of other people's benevolence in the positive experiences and outcomes that one obtains. Notably, these activities are focused on increasing state rather than trait gratitude. Although some scholars have suggested that trait gratitude, much like trait mindfulness, may also be malleable to some degree over time with practice. There are 3 broad types of gratitude interventions that have been examined. The classic gratitude activity that has received the most research attention is making a gratitude list of the things a person is grateful for. Usually this occurs at night before bed each day. There also is grateful contemplation. This is less specific than listing things which one is grateful for, and usually involves thinking or writing about the things people are grateful for in a more global fashion. Finally, there's direct behavioral expressions of gratitude. Here, people are usually instructed to go on a gratitude visit and to write a letter to their benefactor, which is then delivered or read in person. Much research has been done to examine the effectiveness of gratitude interventions, which in many ways have become the gold standard of person-focused well-being interventions. Early primary studies showed support for the effectiveness of gratitude interventions for improving employee well-being and well-being more generally. However, a recent meta-analysis by Davis and colleagues, which is a systematic study of studies, offers a somewhat more nuanced understanding of their effectiveness. These authors' primary research question was how gratitude interventions compare to a measurement-only control condition, which means that people completed the assessment measures but not the activities. Also of interest was how gratitude interventions compared to alternate activity conditions, which included matched activity comparison conditions and so-called psychologically active conditions. Matched activity comparison conditions were inert activities that paralleled the gratitude condition. So for example, just listing something daily as opposed to the things that the person was grateful for. Whereas psychologically active conditions were those where participants were assigned an activity with some level of theoretical or empirical evidence that it may enhance psychological well-being. So, for example, practicing kindness. Notably, the outcomes examined in this meta-analysis were gratitude, anxiety, and overall psychological well-being. So not really affect per se. Results of this meta-analysis showed that gratitude interventions outperform measurement-only controls, perform marginally better than the matched activity comparison condition, and perform no better than psychologically active conditions. Taken together, these results provide somewhat relatively weak support for the efficacy of gratitude interventions and led the authors to suggest that gratitude interventions may primarily operate through placebo effects, meaning participants expect positive outcomes, and so positive outcomes result. Either way, though, this meta-analysis suggests the need for future research to explore adaptations that may help clarify the importance of gratitude interventions, particularly their moderators. So, for example, does increasing the dose or the time spent practicing gratitude matter for well-being? Another person-focused intervention that has the potential to increase affect is by practicing acts of kindness. Broadly speaking, acts of kindness are those that benefit others, typically at some tangible or intangible cost to oneself. Other terms that have been used in psychology to describe this type of behavior are altruism and so-called pro-social behavior. In more popular culture, kindness has been framed as paying it forward. Several types of such interventions have been examined in research studies. These include brief one-time acts of kindness versus instructions to engage in multiple kind acts over a certain period of time. Second, kind acts can also be relatively autonomously versus non-autonomously motivated. Autonomously motivated means that the person performs the kind act simply because they want to, whereas non-autonomously motivated acts are completed because people are being influenced by some sort of external factors, such as being convinced or forced to by others, or even just to avoid disapproval from other people for failing to engage in the act. Lastly, acts of kindness can either be performed as a reciprocal repayment to the original benefactor, or can instead be paid forward to others. Unlike gratitude, there are no meta-analyses that I'm aware of, as there are not many primary studies. Accordingly, I'll present the results of 3 relatively recent, well-designed studies that can hopefully help to answer the question of whether acts of kindness are effective for enhancing affect. These studies also reported effects of kindness on other well-being outcomes, but here I'm focusing on affect. So first, in a study by Alden and True, individuals were randomly assigned to a kindness intervention, a cognitive change exercise, or an activity monitoring condition, which was a neutral control condition that involved listing daily life events for 4 weeks. Results suggested that only participants who engaged in kind acts displayed significant increases in positive affect. And this effect could not be attributed to differential compliance to the intervention or to increased frequency of social contact. Next, TAC used an experimental design to test the hypothesis that lasting improvements in happiness and well-being can be achieved by performing a variety of acts of kindness for a more extended period of 10 weeks. In this study, kind acts included such activities as helping a fellow student study, giving a homeless person spare change, and cleaning the apartment for a roommate who is studying for an exam. Participants in the treatment conditions were asked to perform acts of kindness with varying levels of frequency and variety. Participants in the control conditions, by contrast, were asked simply to record daily events that occurred to them with varying levels of frequency. Results indicated that individuals who systematically performed different acts of kindness for a period of 10 weeks reported lower levels of stress and negative affect, as well as increases in other positive outcomes compared to individuals who did not perform acts of kindness. Additionally, this study revealed that the amount of gratitude expressed by those who may have been helped who have been helped may be an important mechanism underlying the reported boosts in well-being. This is what the authors call the so-called kindness effect. A third study by Dunn and colleagues investigated whether a specific and mandated act of prosocial behavior on a single day would increase mood. This study determined that participants who were randomly assigned to spend $5 or $20 on others were happier at the end of the day than those who opted to spend the same amount on themselves. While the available evidence is narrow, this study suggests that some specific acts of help, even short-lived ones, may have affective benefits for the giver of the good deed. Next, another study found that a one-time forced altruism pay-it-forward activity resulted in a wide range of well-being benefits for givers in the form of greater positive and lower negative affect. Interestingly, in this study, females, or those who identify as females, showed greater positive affect benefits. Lastly, research suggests that autonomous motivation of the volunteer is necessary for both the giver and the receiver of the good deed to experience well-being benefits. Researchers theorize that this is because the quality of help and the effort put into helping from autonomously motivated people is greater, which positively affects the relationship between the giver and the receiver. In other words, people who volunteer for external reasons lose, among other things, the sense of personal competence otherwise associated with autonomously motivated kind acts, and therefore many of the benefits. Related, a feeling of connection that often appears between the givers and receivers of help may be diminished if autonomous motivation is not present on the side of the giver. Next, let's talk about so-called job crafting. This is not a person-focused activity typically highlighted in the positive psychology literature because it is domain-specific, but I'm including it here because it meets the criteria for person-focused interventions as defined earlier. So specifically, job crafting refers to changes individuals make in the task and relational boundaries of their work. Changing task boundaries means altering the form or number of activities one engages in while doing the job. Whereas changing cognitive task boundaries refers to altering how one sees or perceives the job. Changing relational boundaries means exercising discretion over with whom one interacts while doing the job and the social environment in which the person works. Thus, job crafting is an action, and those who undertake it are job crafters. These are proactive, agentic efforts on the part of the incumbent to revise their work roles, and essentially means that the individual changes the identity and meaning of the work, but within the context of the defined job. The idea here is that you turn the job you have into the job you want. It's essentially a creative, improvised process. My guess is that if you're not familiar with the concept already, this probably sounds all very abstract at the moment. So let me provide a few examples. So as an example of changing the number, scope, and type of job tasks would be engineers engaging in relational tasks that move a project to completion. So for example, connecting people in the project to the people and resources needed to do their work, teaching others a new skill, reconnecting coworkers to avoid breaks in relationships, and including everyone in the team efforts. In terms of its effect on the meaning of work, these practices translate into work that is completed in a more timely fashion and changes the meaning of their jobs so that they become guardians over or movers of projects. An example of changing cognitive task boundaries might be nurses who pay closer attention to the patient's world and convey seemingly unimportant information to others on the care team. In doing so, the job is recreated to be about patient advocacy rather than simply delivery of high-quality technical care. Finally, hospital workers may engage in relational crafting by changing the quality and or the amount of interaction with others on the job. This might involve stepping outside the formal job boundaries to engage with other people instead of being passive cleaners who do not seek additional interactions. For example, a person whose job involves cleaning may talk to patients and nurses or show people around, therefore integrating themselves more deeply into the floor unit. Also, although not listed here in the table, another similar example would be hairdressers who seek to create more desirable and affectively pleasant interactions with their clients by doing things such as asking their clients personal questions, trying to exercise some control over those who do not choose to share with the hairdresser, and also by making personal disclosures about themselves. So research shows that job crafting is a rather prevalent phenomenon that appears to hold multiple benefits for those who engage in these actions. This is likely because job crafting allows an individual employee to shape their job to meet their own preferences and needs. Indeed, Slemp and colleagues found that the extent to which employees engaged in job crafting predicted the extent to which their psychological needs were satisfied on the job, which in turn predicted well-being. Specifically, positive emotions and general psychological functioning were enhanced directly through the need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Vanden Heuvel and colleagues conducted a quasi-experimental field study intervention designed to boost job resources, affective well-being, and self-efficacy, which refers to beliefs people have about their abilities to exercise control over events using job crafting behavior. Specifically, in this study, police officers received a one-day training, after which they worked towards self-set crafting goals for a period of 4 weeks. This plan included specific crafting goals such as how to seek resources, how to reduce demands, and how to seek challenges. An example of seeking resources was as follows. Next Tuesday, I will ask for feedback from my colleagues regarding my work on an upcoming project. An example of seeking challenge demands was stating, this week I will start approaching third-party contacts in an effort to build my negotiation skills. And finally, an example of decreasing demands was as follows. Next week, I will take on less written work tasks, and I will make use of my travel time to type up reports. The intervention group reported less negative affect, as well as increased self-efficacy compared to pre-intervention measures. And although not significant, there was a trend toward increases in positive affect. In contrast, the control group showed no significant changes from pre to post measures. It should be noted that these findings are positive, but do not provide the strongest support for the efficacy of job crafting interventions, since the changes were not detected using ANOVA, which is a statistical technique that considers both the intervention and the control group simultaneously. Finally, Timms and colleagues conducted a longitudinal study examining how job crafting relates to a broad range of well-being variables. This study involved chemical plant workers who completed a survey and then later received anonymous feedback regarding their current levels of job demands or resources. Job characteristics that require sustained effort from employees and are therefore associated with certain costs are labeled job demands. In contrast, job characteristics that contribute toward achieving work goals, reducing the effect of job demands, and simultaneously personal development are called job resources. So when given the feedback, participants were also given short examples of how they can reduce these job demands and increase these job resources. So, for example, one suggestion for increasing social job resources recommended that employees eat lunch with other workers or meet with other employees for social drinks after work. The types of social job resources explicitly measured over time in this particular study were social support, feedback, and coaching, whereas structural job resources measured were level of autonomy, the variety of tasks engaged in at work, and opportunities for professional development. They found that crafting structural and social job resources is associated with higher levels of well-being as assessed by a number of different variables. Most relevant to this presentation is support for increased levels of work engagement, specifically, which is a motivational construct that includes an affective component. It's formally defined as an active, positive, work-related state characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption. Further supporting the efficacy of job crafting, the effects of job crafting on well-being were attributed to perceptions of increases in actual structural and social job resources. So taken together, this line of research overall suggests that the job crafting intervention has the potential to enable employees to proactively build a motivating work environment and to improve their own well-being. The fourth and final type of person-focused intervention I'd like to highlight is personal strengths. This is the idea of having people identify their strengths versus just their weaknesses, and is another idea borrowed from the positive psychology literature. In organizations, this intervention entails having employees determine and build the inherent natural strengths that they already possess. There currently are 3 primary strengths-based programs identified in a recent review of applied positive practices. First, there is the Clifton Strengths Finder, which was developed by Gallup and is based on 34 so-called talent themes. So for example, people strong in the so-called achiever theme are said to have a great deal of stamina and take great satisfaction from being busy and productive. People strong in the empathy theme, in contrast, are said to have enhanced abilities to sense the feelings of other people by imagining themselves in other people's lives or situations. Second, the Reflect It Best Self exercise involves providing feedback to participants about who they are when they are at their best. Here, participants request positive feedback from significant individuals in their lives. This feedback is then used to create a description or portrait of the person's best self. Finally, the Values in Action, or VIA classification of character strengths, is a research-based survey that classifies and measures 24 individual differences that are grouped into one of 6 categories. These categories are wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. So cognitive strengths are labeled wisdom and include creativity, curiosity, judgment, love of learning, and perspective, and entail the acquisition and use of knowledge. Emotional strengths are labeled courage and include bravery, perseverance, honesty, and zest, and involve the exercise of will to accomplish goals in the face of external or internal opposition. Next, interpersonal strengths, labeled humility, are the capacity to love and be loved, kindness, social intelligence, which involves tending and befriending others. There also are civic strengths, also called justice, which are attributes such as teamwork, fairness, and leadership, and which underlie healthy community life. Temperance are strengths protecting against excess and include forgiveness, modesty, prudence, and self-regulation. Finally, strengths of transcendence are appreciation of beauty and excellence, gratitude, hope, humor, and spirituality. You may be interested in knowing that the Clifton Strengths Finder has a fee, I believe, but if you're interested, I believe you can take the VIA inventory for free at viacharacter.org. So several studies have highlighted that the application of individual strengths is related to overall positive experiences. Most studies in this arena are merely correlational in nature, But there are a couple of experimental tests of whether and to what degree using personal strengths leads to enhanced emotional well-being. So one such study conducted by Mitchell and colleagues involved asking participants to use their top 3 perceived signature strengths from a list, share it with a friend, and then incorporate it into their daily lives. These researchers found that those participating in a strengths intervention reported increases in a measure of subjective well-being, which includes affect, compared to a placebo control group, but now found no other changes in positive affect or negative affect. Sheldon and Lee Remirsky conducted an experiment comparing a gratitude intervention to a best possible selves intervention I mentioned a few moments ago. They also included a control condition that instructed participants to pay attention to life details. Interestingly, they found that completing all 3 exercises, including the control, resulted in post-intervention reductions in negative affect. But only the best possible self exercise led to increases in positive affect. Perhaps not surprisingly, also continuing to perform the exercise in turn predicted positive mood in the follow-up assessment. A third study carried out by Senth and Lau examined the effects of a strengths-based and gratitude interventions on happiness and depressive symptoms against the control group. Here, the strengths-based intervention involved identification of their top 5 signature strengths through completion of the VIA that I showed you earlier, and a daily task in which participants were asked to use these top strengths in ways that they had not done before. In this study, data were collected at 3 stages: baseline, pretest, post-intervention, and 1-month follow-up. Here, the outcomes assessed were happiness and depression, which, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll consider to be crude markers of positive and negative affect, respectively. At the post-intervention assessment, there were no significant differences in either happiness or depression levels for the participants in the strengths-based intervention as compared to those in the control group. At the 1-month follow-up, however, here that's labeled the second post-test, participants in the strengths-based intervention had significantly higher levels of happiness and significantly lower levels of depression compared to those in the control group. Thus, taken together, these findings lend partial support for the effectiveness of strengths-based interventions in affecting emotional outcomes over time. Lastly, Harzer and Rusch conducted one of the few workplace-specific studies on the topic. Although not an experiment demonstrating causality, this study demonstrated in a large sample of over 1,000 employees with a wide array of occupations that the more individuals applied individual strengths at the workplace, the higher the levels of composite positive experiences there. And it's worth noting that this composite measure included affect. People who expressed less than 4 of their top strengths had less positive experiences at work. In other words, this research suggests that using at least 4 signature strengths regularly at work is associated with the greatest gains in well-being. So there are a number of other person-focused interventions that unfortunately I don't have time to describe in detail in this webinar, but I wanted to list here in case you are interested in learning more about them. So briefly, these other interventions include practicing mindfulness, which involves noticing and observing emotional reactions, both negative and positive, as they are in the present, without conferring any sort of judgment. The combination of present-focused awareness and acceptance that's a part of this strategy may, it's said, lead to better emotion regulation insofar as it allows people to effectively respond to situations rather than simply reflexively react to them, as we all tend to do. Goal setting involves planning for the future by stating and monitoring progress toward the completion of specific self-set goals. These types of interventions are mostly examined in relation to goal completion and performance, But there has been some initial work looking to see how these goal-setting interventions can influence well-being. In particular, scholars suggest that goal-setting interventions have the potential to influence well-being through their impact on people's sense of control, competency, and empowerment gained from setting and achieving goals. Finally, psychological capital refers to a specific training program designed to enhance the 4 proposed building blocks of so-called psychological capital. And these are self-efficacy, optimism, hope, and resilience. There's a group of scholars who have devoted much of their career to examining the effectiveness of this particular training method, and it has been shown to be quite successful under certain conditions. So what can we take away from all of the research is that emotional well-being is malleable and can be promoted through a variety of person-focused interventions that share the common feature of intentional activities that promote positive feelings, thoughts, and/or behaviors. Research shows that some of these methods are quite effective, and because they are typically simple behaviors that can be easily incorporated into daily life, they have the potential, I would suggest, to benefit the well-being of employees and of organizations more generally. So I'd like to conclude this webinar by briefly proposing a research agenda for continuing to understand person-focused interventions, aiming specifically to improve emotional well-being and emotion regulation. So first, a key question that needs to be answered to develop a more systematic deployment of interventions for well-being is an understanding of why these interventions work. While many studies have shown that they do work, very few have tested or demonstrated the causal mechanisms through which they operate. This is important to understand because it can help to inform the design of interventions moving forward, among other things. Related, we also need more research understanding moderators of their effectiveness, specifically for whom, under which conditions, and when these interventions are effective. So, for example, does the type of job a person has or their personality traits matter? Does this influence how effective the intervention is? All of these contextual factors need to be taken into account. Third, most of these studies are done in the short term and do not collect much follow-up data after the intervention has ended. So the question I have is, do these effects decay over time? And do follow-up or regular maintenance sessions help to counter the effects of any decay? Fourth, organizational scholars currently have a decent understanding of how interventions affect general affect and, in turn, organizational outcomes. In order for this science to mature, though, we need to understand how these interventions impact the discrete emotions I mentioned earlier, and further, which specific outcomes these can be linked to. So, for example, if kindness acts work by inducing gratitude, what organizational outcomes does gratitude matter for? There's been some preliminary work on this, but much more research is needed in this regard. And I would suggest that this is particularly relevant for practitioners with limited resources who want to choose the type of intervention that is likely to yield the highest desired gains. Finally, people pursuing this type of research should be sure to implement rigorous research designs for properly evaluating the efficacy of a given intervention. Ideally, this would be a randomized controlled intervention so that causality could be concluded. And the other thing I want to mention is that there have been an increase in the number of interventions done in the context of organizations and the workplace, but certainly we do need to see if many of the findings that are not domain specific or applied more generally also apply to the workplace. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much for your interest in this material and for your attention. I believe we will now enter into the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have any questions for me that you'd like to ask offline, please feel free to email me using the email address listed here. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We do have some time now. If anyone has any questions, they can either enter them into the Q&A section or the chat portion. But while we're waiting for folks to ask you a question, Carolyn, I wondered about how much these kinds of methods are accepted by employees. I mean, do employers have to also demonstrate changing working conditions in order for these to be successful?
Yeah, it's a good question. So are you wondering whether there could be any potential for like negative backlash from employees who, you know, are putting the effort into enhancing their well-being themselves, but may not be also simultaneously receiving support from the organization?
Yes, I mean, I was thinking, for example, like, how would you get buy-in for somebody to participate in job crafting if they felt that their employer wasn't, you know, doing anything to change working conditions to reduce their stress and to make their job more engaging?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think if I were advising an individual, I would say, hey, look, like this is, your employer may not be putting forth the effort, but you know, this is something that is within your control and that you can do on your own and is, you know, shown to be relatively effective. In the meantime, you know, that doesn't mean that it's also not important for employers to, you know, step up their game and make sure they're doing things to impact the well-being of their employees. But I see it as a good interim activity while the organization is hopefully moving towards changes that will positively impact the lives and quality of life of the individuals that work for them.
Yes, I think that it's, I think one of the things that's hard for, say, somebody like me who doesn't really know much about this is to think that, you know, the primary thing is for, you know, not the individual to feel responsible for them being in a, you know, toxic work environment, but that on the work environment and the employer to change to support a better working environment for the individual. So it's that kind of, where does the responsibility lie piece that I guess I was wondering.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't mean to suggest that the onus should be put on the employee. I offer these simple, and I think the people who are researching these offer these strategies as, you know, a potential that for the employees who are really struggling and aren't, you know, seeing the changes from their employer, that this is, you know, something that they can actually do to try to help themselves when no one else is.
Yes, I wondered if also you could say, I know you mentioned mindfulness and goal setting and psychological capital, and I wondered if you had any sort how do those compare to the person-focused methods you described, or is that still sort of to be determined? Or
Yeah, so I would consider those to also be person-focused interventions. I did not include them in the presentation because, well, for one, mindfulness has received a fair amount of support, and psychological capital is a bit more of I don't want to say fringe activity, but it's less on the radar. But you know, the initial research is promising. You know, I think all of these activities can be distinguished going back to, let me see if I can get back to it here, the process model of emotion regulation that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Let's see here. This one. So for example, mindfulness and people may differ in their opinion on this, but I would suggest that it falls under the cognitive change part of this model. Whereas, let's see, what are the other ones I covered?
Goal setting and psychological capital.
Goal setting, that's a tough one, but I might put that under attentional deployment because it, and also maybe situation selection and modification because it involves, you set certain goals based on an understanding of their emotional consequences in part. So I think goal setting could be considered representative of that aspect of emotion regulation. Also, mindfulness could also be considered perhaps attentional deployment as well, which refers to thinking about something other than the emotion. I'm a little bit, now that I'm saying that, I don't think that applies so much, so scratch that. But yeah, I think that the beauty of this model is that I think all of the different strategies that I've outlined fall somewhere along here. And it's just kind of a matter of which strategies the individual wants to use. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from a participant who commented, I assume would get more resistance from older employees if they attempted your suggestions, and wondered if there were similar results across age ranges or better results with younger employees.
That's a great question. I don't know of any research examining that question, but that would be one of those moderators that I propose at the end of the presentation in the research agenda portion. So specifically, I could see lots of great reasons theoretically for why that might be the case. I'm not personally aware of any research on the topic. There are, however, some efforts to examine personality traits. So again, looking at like individual differences similar to age that impact people's perceptions of and willingness to participate in these interventions. So yeah, it could definitely be a fruitful avenue for future research. My guess is that among older individuals, these may be less positively perceived. I could be wrong about that. Again, it's an empirical question, so we'll have to see. It's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yes. Well, perhaps we have time for one more question. But I wondered just about, the personal strength programs that you had mentioned. Are they used at all by employers in the workplace, or is that something more of a kind of personal choice?
Yeah, they are used by employers. I believe some of the different surveys that I provided on the slides do have options to be bought by organizations for their employees, so kind of like a bulk purchase. Yeah. So yes, they definitely are used among practitioners. I think that part of the disconnect there is that academics have been slower to recognize their importance and to evaluate their effectiveness. So I think that those are much more common in practice than in research. But we have seen an increase in the number of research studies attempting to address the question.
Well, thank you so much. It was a really informative webinar. We really appreciate your spending the time to share your knowledge with us. And again, I'd like to thank the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces for co-sponsoring today's webinar. So everybody who participated will receive a follow-up email with a link to the presentation. And again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.